This morning we're going to be looking at a lesson that is entitled Learning to be Loyal. And this is one of our lessons in our series on the life of David. I think we're up to number 4 now. And it's going to be taken from 1 Samuel chapter 20. If you have your Bibles, be turning over there with me and you can read along in this biblical account. And we're going to draw some lessons from this chapter as we read it this morning. This lesson is based upon Jonathan and David's very close friendship. And when you think about the word loyalty, as you're turning over there, I'll kind of give you a few things to think about. If you can turn and think at the same time, that's kind of hard for me. But if you look up the definition of loyal, it means giving or showing firm and constant support or allegiance to a person or institution. Another definition is faithful to one's oath, commitments or obligations. And loyalty is an absolute essential in life. Not only in life, but more importantly in relationships. It's impossible for a relationship to survive without two people, both sides, being loyal in that relationship. Now I want you to think about that for a moment because that's true. I'm going to give 3 different examples here and just kind of ponder this idea. If you aren't constant in a relationship, if you aren't firm in showing your support and allegiance to another person, if you're not faithful to your oaths or your commitments or your obligations toward them, that is not going to be a healthy relationship. Now that's true in a husband and wife relationship. If they aren't loyal to one another, then problems are going to rise. They might face divorce. They're certainly going to bring harm to themselves, bring harm to the children involved also, as well as influence their family and their friends. It's true in the worker and employer relationship. You know, if an employee is not faithful to his employer, if he's not putting in the work that he's supposed to in the hours that he's logging in, then that's, in the long run, that's going to hurt the company, isn't it? And not only is it going to hurt the company, but if the employer finds out that this employee is not doing the work that he's getting paid for, it's also going to hurt him because eventually he's going to be fired. It's true in a student-teacher relationship. If a teacher is not committed to imparting knowledge to their student, then that relationship is not going to be a good one. And if you flip-flop that, if a student is not committed to learning and to listening and to doing the work that the teacher assigns them, then there's no way that that can be a healthy relationship. The point that I'm trying to make is loyalty is essential to a healthy relationship. And it's not just true in the realm of a friendship, it's true in about every physical relationship that we enjoy in this life. Loyalty is the subject of our study this morning. And seldom in history has such loyalty existed between two people as is described in 1 Samuel chapter 20, the loyalty between David and Jonathan in the friendship that they'd enjoyed. And so we want to look at 1 Samuel chapter 20, and we want to look at some things that we learn about how to be loyal in a relationship that can help us not only in our friendships, but in our marriages, in our employment, in learning in general in life. The first thing that I'll submit unto you that we learn about loyalty in this chapter is that loyalty necessitates cooperating in times of need. We're going to read about this difficult situation that David is in, and you probably remember some of it from last week, but if you weren't with us last week, remember that Saul had this plot on David's life that failed. And remember that David's wife, who was Saul's daughter, let him down over the wall to escape through a window, and he runs off to Naboth in order to kind of hide out with Samuel. And here he is in this situation in verse 1 of 1 Samuel chapter 20. It says, "And David fled from Naboth in Ramah, and came and said before Jonathan, What have I done? What is mine iniquity? And what is my sin before thy father, that he seeketh my life? And he said unto him, God forbid, thou shalt not die. Behold, my father will do nothing, either great or small, but that he will show it me. And why should my father hide this from me? It is not so. And David sware moreover and said, Thy father certainly knoweth that I have found grace in thine eyes. And he saith, Let not Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved. But as truly as the Lord liveth, and as thy soul liveth, there is but a step between me and death. Then said Jonathan unto David, Whatsoever thy soul desireth, I will even do it for thee. We talked last week, we didn't really read about it, but in 1 Samuel chapter 18, the beginning of the chapter, we read about how Jonathan makes a covenant with David. And he did that because they were such strong friends. And so they made a great commitment. They made a great covenant between the two of them that invoked the name of Jehovah God. And that covenant was that they were going to be loyal to one another as long as they lived, and even to their descendants that would come after them. And so Jonathan has made this covenant with David, and David has made this covenant with Jonathan that they're going to be loyal to one another. And now the depths of Jonathan's loyalty are about to be tested, because David comes before him and he says, Listen, your dad is trying to kill me again. Now what you have to understand is, you back up to chapter 19 as we studied last week, Jonathan learned about this public declaration, or you could basically say that Saul put out a hit on David. And Jonathan comes to Saul and he reasons with him a little bit. And he says, Listen, what has David ever done to you? You know, what has David ever done to Israel? The only thing that he's ever done is defeat one of the greatest warriors that we've ever seen, Goliath. The only thing that he's ever done is win victory after victory for the nation of Israel over their enemy. And so why are you trying to kill this man when he's done nothing personally towards you or anybody else? And remember that Saul was persuaded by this speech that Jonathan made, and he said, You're right. And so he recounts that hit that he put out on David, and he basically invites him back into the court, and he puts him back in charge of his army. And so David, it's after this that David comes to Jonathan, and he says, Listen, your dad is trying to kill me again. And Jonathan says, No, you don't remember. He swore with an oath that he would not harm you. Remember that? And David said, Listen, I'm telling you that this is the case. And so the question is going to be, would Jonathan help David or not? Would he believe what David is telling him? Would he cooperate with him in order to try to understand, or is he going to side with his father? You know, the king of Israel, Saul, had attempted to kill David numerous times, more recently in the last few days that we're reading about here. And so what is David going to do? Who can he go to in his time of need? Well, if you can't go to the highest person in the nation of Israel, which was Saul, and certainly you wouldn't want to go before him, you've got to go to the next highest person. And that is the king's son, Jonathan. And so David is going to the only person who can help him in this matter, who can provide him any assistance. And Jonathan, true to the commitment, true to the vow of loyalty that he had made to David, notice what he says in verse 4. He says, I'm going to help you whatever the price. Whatever you need, whatever you want, I will come to your aid. I will help you. And that's what we've got to understand, first of all, about loyalty. Listen, it's easy to be committed to a person when everything's going great in their life. But when the problems arise, and it takes some commitment from us, it takes some of our energy and some of our time and some of our resources, then that's when you learn who is really loyal to you and not. You know, when you're out there on the end of a limb, who's going to come to your aid? Who's going to be there to help you in your time of need? If we're loyal to one another, we will be there. We will cooperate with other people in their time of need. And you see that in the life here of Jonathan and David. Notice in verse 5. And David said unto Jonathan, Behold, tomorrow is the new moon, and I should not fail to sit with the king at meat, but let me go that I may hide myself in the field unto the third day at even. If thy father at all miss me, then say, David earnestly asked leave of me that he might run to Bethlehem his city, for there is a yearly sacrifice there for all the family. If he say thus, It is well, thy servant shall have peace. But if he be very wroth, then be sure that evil is determined by him.
Therefore thou shalt deal kindly with thy servant, for thou hast brought thy servant into a covenant of the Lord with thee. Notwithstanding, if there be in me iniquity, slay me thyself. For why shouldest thou bring me to thy father? Well, David has asked Jonathan for help. And Jonathan tells him, whatever you need, whatever assistance I can provide for you, I'll do it. He's not fully persuaded that Saul is really trying to kill David again. In his mind, again, this oath that Saul has taken is still overpowering anything that David is saying. But he's saying, since I'm your friend and since I've made this covenant with you, I'll help you in any way that I can. And so what David does is he devises this plan whereby he and Jonathan can learn about Saul's feelings toward him. And the way that he does this is Saul had called this royal feast, and I don't know if it were for social purposes or religious purposes, but notice in verse 5, David made the statement there. He says, it's coming at the new moon, and I should not fail to sit with the king at meat. Now, what do you mean by that statement? Well, he was expected to be there, and a couple of reasons why. Number one, he was the king's son-in-law. So he was expected to be here at that gathering. Number two, he was a commander over at least part of the armies of Israel and of Saul. And so anybody who was in a position of power or authority under the rule of Saul was expected to be there. And so David said, here's what we'll do. I'm not going to show up. And if Saul asks about me and you tell him, what's happened, and he just kind of blows it off, then we know that there's nothing to this idea that Saul wants to kill me. But if you tell Saul why I'm not there, and evidently David's not lying here, but it coincided with his family, some of his family's regular gatherings. And so he asked Jonathan, he said, will you grant me leave from this feast? Will you allow me to go to Bethlehem, to my home city, and to my family and observe this yearly feast that we observe together? Now understand, if David was going to be excused from this feast by anybody, it should have been from the lips of Saul. He was the king. And so Jonathan's kind of taken a little bit of prerogative here. He's kind of taken a little bit of liberty and dismissing David himself. And so David thinks that might cause a rift in and of itself. The fact that Saul didn't okay this, but his son did. And we'll learn right then and right there what Saul really thinks about me. And so his plan was for Jonathan to attend this dinner and to see what Saul's reaction was to David being absent from it. Again, you see the loyalty of Jonathan here, because he's willing to help David in this time of need. And if we're going to be loyal to one another, that's what we have to do. We have to, whenever people call upon us, we have to be like Jonathan, and we have to step forward and be willing to lend a helping hand. So it necessitates, loyalty necessitates cooperating in times of need. The second thing that I'll submit unto you that we learn about loyalty is that it demands an unbreakable bond or companionship. We might even say a friendship. There's nothing and no one that is going to come between this relationship of David and Jonathan. And notice in verse 9, Jonathan says, far be it from thee, for if I knew certainly that evil were determined by my father to come upon thee, then would not I tell it thee? Then said David to Jonathan, who shall tell me? Or what if thy father answer thee roughly? And Jonathan said unto David, come and let us go out into the field. And they went out both of them into the field. And Jonathan said unto David, O Lord God of Israel, when I have sounded my father about tomorrow any time, or the third day, and behold, if there be good toward David, and I then sin not unto thee and show it thee, the Lord do so and much more to Jonathan. But if it please my father to do thee evil, then will I show it thee and send thee away, that thou mayest go in peace. And the Lord be with thee as he hath been with my father. Now I want you to notice that Jonathan once again strongly affirms his loyalty to David. He's saying, listen, I'm not trying to hide anything from you. I haven't heard anything about my father wanting to kill you. I don't know about any secret plot that he's come up with to try to kill you. But I'm going to stick with you through this, and we're going to figure it out together. And I'm going to let you know one way or the other. If Saul is okay with you, I'll tell you straight up. If he's wanting to kill you, I'll let you know so that you can escape and nothing is going to happen to you. And so David immediately forms this plan, and Jonathan cooperates with him, and they go into this thing together. Now, as David and he are talking about this, it's kind of interesting in verse 10 there. It seems like Jonathan kind of wants David to come along with him to the feast and just ask Saul together. And he says, well, you could go to your dad and you could ask him in private, but I'm already there. And then what happens if Saul says, yeah, I want to kill him, and here I am in the middle of this feast, and I'm surrounded by all of his servants. I'm not going to be able to get out of there. I'm not going to be able to escape. And so Jonathan says, well, let's go outside and talk about this. And so they go aside privately for many of the ears of those who would be within the dwelling place of Saul, or the loyal servants of Saul, and they begin talking more about this plan. And so he swears to him that he's going to find out how Saul feels about David, and he's going to provide him with the information that he needs. Notice in verse 14, and thou shalt not only, while yet I live, show me the kindness of the Lord, that I die not, but also thou shalt not cut off thy kindness from my house forever. Know not when the Lord hath cut off the enemies of David, every one from the face of the earth. So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, let the Lord even require it at the hand of David's enemies. And Jonathan caused David to swear again, because he loved him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul. What has Jonathan done? He's just put himself out here, and he says, listen, I'm going to do everything that I can for you in this matter, but I want you to swear something to me. I want you to swear to me that you'll do everything for me that you can whenever you become king. And notice what he's concerned about there in verse 14. He says, not only me, while I'm living, not only do I want you to continue to show me kindness while I'm alive, but in verse 15, also all of my descendants. This is important, because what he's asking David to do is to reaffirm his loyalty. He's asking him to swear in an oath that whenever David becomes king, that he would not kill Jonathan. Now you might think, well, if they were such great friends, why would David kill Jonathan in the first place? Because he was Saul's son. He was the next heir to the throne of Israel. And as was the custom in this day and age, a lot of times whenever a king entered into the royal office, when he sat upon the throne, one of the first things that he did was purge the old descendants. It wasn't uncommon for them to go back and to kill every living descendant of the person who rose or reigned before them, so that there wasn't any competition. And so understand what Jonathan is asking David to do is unheard of. I mean, it's something that no other king or no other nation would do. I want you to keep me alive. I want you to show me kindness, not just keep me alive, but be good to me. And I want you to keep my descendants alive too, that would come after me. And so this is part of this unbreakable friendship, this unbreakable companionship that they have formed. In verse 18, then Jonathan says to David, tomorrow is the new moon, and thou shalt be missed, because thy seat will be empty. And when thou hast stayed 3 days, then shalt thou go down quickly, and come to the place where thou didst hide thyself when the business was in hand, and shalt remain by the stone Ezel. And I will shoot 3 arrows on the side thereof, as though I shot at a mark. And behold, I will send a lad, saying, go find out the arrows. If I expressly say unto the lad, behold, I will send a lad, I've got mixed up here, behold, the arrows are on this side of thee, take them, then come thou, for there is peace to thee, and no hurt, as the Lord liveth. But if I say thus unto the young man, behold, the arrows are beyond thee, go thy way, for the Lord has sent thee away. And as touching the matter which thou and I have spoken of, behold, the Lord be between thee and me forever. It's interesting here that Jonathan, David came up with this plan, and Jonathan kind of comes up with the way to convey the answer. So he says, here's what I'll do. Here's my part of the plan. I'm going to fine tune it just a little bit. I'm going to throw some things in here to kind of help you out. And so after 3 days, I'm going to come out and I'm going to let you know how Saul reacted. And the way that I'm going to do that is by shooting some arrows I'm going to shoot some arrows. I'm going to send my servant, young boy, after it. Tell him to get the arrows. And if I say, they're right beside you, don't go any further, then you'll know you can stay right where you are. But if I tell him you're not, they're further beyond you, you have to run away in order to get them, then you'll know you need to run away from Saul. And so he adds a little bit of his own spin to this story or to this plan. Now what you're reading about here and what I want to emphasize is through all of this speech and this planning, their loyalty to one another is unbreakable. They're going to be faithful to one another no matter what. They're not going to betray each other. When either one of them needs help, here's David and he needs help. He's in a precarious situation. But later on, Jonathan's going to be in need of help because David's going to become king. And so we're not going to allow the physical situations, the people that surround us, the things that are happening to us to break this great companionship, this friendship that we have. So neither one are going to turn away. Either one is going to do whatever they need to do. The third thing that we learn about loyalty in reading this chapter is it requires us to put aside, to conquer all jealousy and envy. Notice in verse 24, it says, So David hid himself in the field, and when the new moon was come, the king set him down to eat meat. And the king sat upon his seat, as at other times, even upon a seat by the wall. And Jonathan arose, and Abner sat by Saul's side, and David's place was empty. Nevertheless, Saul spake not anything that day, for he thought, Something hath befallen him, he is not clean. Surely he is not clean. And it came to pass on the morrow, which was the second day of the month, that David's place was empty. And Saul said unto Jonathan his son, Wherefore cometh not the son of Jesse to eat meat, neither yesterday nor today? And Jonathan answered Saul, David earnestly asked leave of me to go to Bethlehem. And he said, Let me go, I pray thee, for our family hath a sacrifice in the city, and my brother, he hath commanded me to be there. And now if I have found favor in thine eyes, let me get away, I pray thee, and see my brethren. Therefore he cometh not unto the king's table. Then Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan. And he said unto him, Thou son of the perverse rebellious woman, do not I know that thou hast chosen the son of Jesse to thine own confusion, and unto the confusion of thy mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse liveth upon the ground, thou shalt not be established, nor thy kingdom. Wherefore now send and fetch him unto me, for he shall surely die. And Jonathan answered Saul his father, and said unto him, Wherefore shall he be slain? What hath he done? And Saul cast a javelin at him to smite him, whereby Jonathan knew that it was determined of his father to slay David. So Jonathan arose from the table in fierce anger, and did eat no meat the second day of the month, for he was grieved for David, because his father had done him shame. Here you have the story of this plan that Jonathan and David devised unfolding. And the Bible tells us this was a 3-day feast. The first day, David's seat was empty, and Saul looked at it. He probably thought, well, that's a little weird, but he must have a reason why he's not here. Maybe he touched something that was dead. And so he's unclean, and by the law, he can't, assemble here with everybody else till he's been purged for the day. He'll be here tomorrow. And so the first day he says nothing. The second day, David's still not there. And so he asks Jonathan the question, where's David at? Why isn't he here at this royal feast that I've decreed? And Jonathan says, well, he had a family sacrifice that he had attended, or wanted to attend, and he asked me if he could be excused from this feast, so I excused him. And the reaction of Saul tells it all, right? Immediately, Saul is so infuriated with his own son that he basically, we would probably say he starts, cussing him out. That's what he's doing here. He's throwing a lot of derogatory remarks toward his way. And so he is chastising Jonathan for allowing David not to be there. Saul was hoping to kill him at that feast, undoubtedly. And the fact that he wasn't there had spoiled all these great plans. And why does Saul want to kill David? Because he's jealous of him. Because he's envious of the fact that he's going to become the next king of Israel. And he wants his son Jonathan to be just as jealous of David, to be just as envious of David as he is. He said, you can't be friends with this guy. As long as he's allowed to live, you're not going to be king over Israel. And so if you want to become king, you have got to kill David. David has to die in order for your kingdom to be established. Now understand, Jonathan was the natural heir to the throne. And when I say the natural heir, I mean physically the next one in line. He was also older than David. The fact that he was older than David had to rub a little bit on him, I would think, or at least it had to go through his mind. And here David is the one who's getting all the praise, who's getting all the adoration that should belong to Jonathan, the next king of Israel. But you know what's interesting when you read about Jonathan here? Jonathan doesn't perceive David as a threat. He's not jealous of the fact that he's going to be king. He's not jealous that all these people are acknowledging him and giving him this praise. He's not envious of the position that he's getting ready to occupy. And so Saul, seeing David as a threat and understanding that Jonathan didn't look at David that way. In fact, he looked at him as a loyal friend. He calls him the son of an evil woman. Now, he's not trying to slander his wife by making that statement, but he's trying to slander Jonathan. You know, you've been born of an evil and a wicked woman. You're a wicked son. And then he talks about you've discovered your mother's nakedness. And that's a phrase in the Old Testament that carries with it the idea of shame. You're doing something shameful here by not being jealous and envious of David. You're doing something you're shaming me, you're shaming your mother, you're shaming your heritage by being friends with this young man. And so there's never any indication, though, in the scripture when you read it, that Jonathan ever felt jealous, that he ever felt envious of David. In fact, the opposite is true. All he felt were good things toward David. Now, I want you to stop and to think about this, because I don't think we often appreciate the gravity of this situation. Do you realize that Jonathan had to go against his own father? He had to turn against the wishes and the feelings of his own father. And not only that, but a lot of other high-ranking officials who shared the same sentiment that Saul had toward David. That, friend, I don't care who you are, to have to turn against your own father would have been something that was very difficult to do. But Jonathan did it. He sided with David instead of siding with his father and all these higher officials. And so what happens? Well, Saul becomes so enraged at his own son that he tries to kill him. He throws a javelin. He throws the spear at him. And Jonathan narrowly escapes death. Now, notice this reaction. This is interesting to me in verse 34. It says, so Jonathan arises from the table in fierce anger and did eat no meat the second day of the month. Here's why. For he was grieved for David because his father had done him shame. He wouldn't even eat that day. He wouldn't even sit down with the family and eat at that feast. Not because his own father had tried to kill him, but because the way that his father had treated David. He was so upset at the shameful way that Saul was acting toward David that he would not even sit down with him and eat. Well, despite all the odds, Jonathan was able to put aside any jealousy or any envy that the natural world would have said that he needed toward David. And that's what we have to do too. Listen, sometimes when we think about friendships, we get too competitive in things. I mean, everybody wants to succeed, right? Everybody wants to come out on top. And so you have two friends and they apply for the same job. Listen, one's going to get it, the other's not. Should I be jealous of the one who gets it? Should I be envious of their position? They've not done anything wrong, right? They went through the same application process that you did. They appealed to the same people. They answered the same questions. Now you can start saying, well, there's sometimes favorites in there. But the bottom line is there's nothing to be jealous or envious of. Listen, if Jonathan and David could get along without allowing jealousy and envy to come into their relationship, what little things we have to compete with in life, we can get along too. Sometimes you see it when it comes to members of the opposite sex. Maybe two people are competing for the same person. One's going to get them, one's not, or maybe both won't get them. But the point is, there's nothing to be jealous and envious about. The same is true when you think about an award. The same is true in the realm of sports. I know we've got a lot of people over here pretty competitive in sports, right? Well, listen, somebody's going to win, somebody's going to lose. Should we hate people because they won? Should we be jealous? Should we be envious of them? No. We've got to learn to be loyal. And so Jonathan was not upset. He was not envious or jealous that David was going to become the next king. He was ashamed in the way that his father felt and the way that he acted toward David. The last thing that I'll mention that we learn about loyalty here is it means keeping our commitments. If we're going to be loyal to one another in our relationships, we've got to keep our word. Notice verse 35. It came to pass in the morning that Jonathan went out in the field at the time appointed with David and a little lad with him. And he said unto his lad, Run, find out now the arrows which I shoot. And as the lad ran, he shot an arrow beyond him. And when the lad was come to the place of the arrow which Jonathan had shot, Jonathan cried after the lad and said, Is not the arrow beyond thee? And Jonathan cried after the lad, Make speed, haste, stay not. And Jonathan's lad gathered up the arrows and came to his master. But the lad knew not anything, only Jonathan and David knew the matter. And Jonathan gave his artillery unto his lad, and said unto him, Go, carry them to the city. And as soon as the lad was gone, David arose out of the place toward the south, and fell on his face to the ground, and bowed himself 3 times. And they kissed one another, and wept one with another, until David exceeded. And Jonathan said to David, Go in peace, for as much as we have sworn, both of us, in the name of the Lord, saying, The Lord be between me and thee, and between my seed and thy seed forever. And he arose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city. You know, Jonathan did exactly what he promised to do. He told David he would come back, he would shoot those arrows, and what he said to his lad would indicate to David the reaction of Saul. So he kept the commitment, the promise that he made to David. It's interesting to note, I don't think we appreciate the gravity of the moment here once again, but it's interesting to note that this is the last time that Jonathan and David are going to see one another. And I think in their own minds, they kind of knew that. You know, here's David running for his life. And any reader can feel the emotions that are involved in that moment. You know, David, the Bible says that David wept the most, but Jonathan is right by his side, and he's weeping also. And they know that this is going to be the end of their public interaction. They're no longer going to be able to associate with one another, but yet there's tremendous loyalty that exists between them. But notice in that last verse, that commitment is brought up again, that loyalty. We're going to be loyal to one another, and we're going to be loyal to our descendants forever. You know what's interesting? A little later on in the story, in the book of 2 Samuel in chapter 9, you'll read about Jonathan has died. David didn't know his fate, but he dies in battle. Kind of spoiler alert here. But after he's died and David is now established as king, notice what he says in 2 Samuel 9 and verse 3. He says, Is there not yet any of the house of Saul, that I may show the kindness of God unto him? And Ziba said unto the king, Jonathan hath yet a son, which is lame on his feet. And in verse 7, David says to this son, Fear not, for I will surely show thee kindness for Jonathan thy father's sake, and will restore thee all the land of Saul thy father, and thou shalt eat bread at my table continually. Let me remind you, at this point, Jonathan's dead. Jonathan wouldn't have had any idea. It wouldn't have mattered to him one way or the other if David did this or not. But David made a promise. He made a commitment to Jonathan. And that commitment, that promise was, I'll deal kindly with you as long as you're alive, and I'll deal kindly with your descendants too. And so he searches across the kingdom to find somebody who's related to Jonathan, and he finds one of his sons. And he says, I'm going to show you kindness because of a covenant that I made with your father. I'm going to give you back all the land that Saul possessed while he was king. Think about that. And you're going to eat at my table. I'm going to feed you every day, every meal. You're going to eat right here. It's not going to cost you a thing. I'm going to provide everything for you. Why did he do all those things? Well, it would have been more physically beneficial to break that promise, wouldn't it, to David? But he did it because he was loyal. He was loyal to Jonathan.
And part of being loyal to somebody means keeping the commitments that you made to them, keeping the promises and the oaths. You know, when we study the New Testament, the Bible emphasizes to us that we need to be people of our word. When we make a promise, we need to be loyal to that promise. Our word as Christians is supposed to be our bond. We need to say what we mean and mean what we say. And we should never make a promise that we don't intend to keep. And that's what David did. He didn't care if Jonathan was dead or alive. He intended to keep that promise. What have we learned about loyalty from 1 Samuel chapter 20? Well, the first thing that I'll submit unto you is it's absolutely essential to any healthy relationship. Without it in a relationship, that relationship cannot be maintained. It's not going to be a healthy relationship. What does loyalty teach us? It teaches us that we need to help those who we're loyal to in their time of need. It doesn't matter what their situation is. It doesn't matter how difficult it may be. We need to reach out to them and do anything like Jonathan and everything that we can to help them in that situation. It demands that commitment, that companionship, that friendship stays intact regardless of who comes along or what happens. And you see that between David and Jonathan. And in order to do that, we can't be envious of one another. We can't be jealous of one another's successes in life. We can't want what the other person has. That's not going to be conducive to a good relationship. And then we have to keep the commitments that we make. If we promise somebody something, we need to stand true to that promise regardless of what happens in our life. And if we'll do that in our relationships, think about how that will improve our relationships. That's true whether it's a husband and wife relationship, a parent and a child relationship. It's true between a friend relationship, an employer and an employee, even a student and a teacher relationship. It can improve any and every relationship that we have in this life. I want to end this morning by asking you this question. We studied about we learned about loyalty this morning. But how is your loyalty to God? How is your loyalty to God? You know, all these things that we talked about this morning are important to maintaining a healthy relationship with God. God is always going to be loyal in that relationship. We don't have to worry about Him. He's always going to be true. He's always going to be what He needs to be in that two-sided relationship. But are we loyal to God just when everything's easy? You know, when the difficult things happen in life, like the difficult thing that happened in the life of David, do we turn away from God? Do we put aside our loyalties to Him? Do we ever let other people or other things come between us and God? Remember that unbreakable friendship, companionship that Jonathan and David had where no one or nothing could come between them? Do we allow those things to interrupt that relationship with God? And then, are we keeping our commitments that we've made to God? Listen, when we become a Christian, we make a commitment to God. We make a promise. And that is to walk by His commandments, to do the best that we can. Are we keeping our end of the bargain? Are you being loyal to God? Friends, if you're not a child of God this morning, why not express your loyalty by obeying the gospel of Christ? If you've already been baptized into Christ, if you're already a faithful child of God, you've obeyed the gospel, and you've sinned in a public way, and you need to make a public response, we'd encourage you to please come